So I'm going to talk today about the U.S. intervention in Somalia, which started in December of 1992 when 28,000 U.S. troops were sent on a mission of mercy to help secure the delivery of food and medicine to people who were starving from a famine. It ended in March of 1994, 6 months after U.S. forces were bloodied in a clash with a Somali warlord. So now we're more than 20 years after the departure of the last U.S. troops from Somalia, but I think this is still an important case to talk about for a variety of reasons. First, it was important in its own right and would have a big impact on subsequent debates about whether and how to do armed humanitarian interventions. It is also important because it's going to illustrate a number of the dilemmas that are associated with policies designed to use military force to intervene in the domestic affairs of other countries for humanitarian ends, such as to relieve human suffering that results from a civil war or genocide. Now, the Somalia operation came at a really important juncture in international history. The Cold War had ended, the U.S. victory in the Persian Gulf War. These things had left the United States without traditional security threats, and we were on the world stage as clearly the predominant unchallenged military power. It led to a sense that perhaps we could use that power for more noble ends, and Somalia is really going to usher in a period when the question of armed humanitarian intervention was very high on the U.S. foreign policy agenda. It would be followed in short order by debates whether or not to intervene and decisions to intervene in places like Haiti, Bosnia, Kosovo, and of course the decision not to get involved in the genocide that took place in Rwanda in 1994. Of course, 9/11 and the subsequent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan brought traditional security concerns back to the fore, but humanitarian intervention is still on the agenda today. Most recently, we saw U.S. intervention in Libya justified in humanitarian terms. And of course, the ongoing crisis in Syria has this quality. So it's interesting to revisit this case from 20 years ago. The intervention in Somalia embodied both the promise and the disillusionment associated with this kind of policy. It started with great fanfare and optimism that we could use our military power to make people's lives better and to relieve human suffering. And it ended with bitter disappointment, right, when our troops were killed by the people we had sent to help. And it led to a wariness about getting involved in these kinds of operations again. So it's a useful case for thinking about why does the United States use military power for these purposes and the dilemmas that we face in doing so. So the two big questions that I ask about this Somalia intervention that I want to talk about today are why did we go in and why did we ultimately fail? Now, in the wake of the Somalia operation, a conventional answer developed in response to these questions. The argument arose that we could understand both the decision to go in and our ultimate failure with reference to two sets of images. The one image that I'm showing you here, starving Somali children. And the argument was that images of the devastation of the famine in Somalia beamed into people's homes by 24-hour news programs like CNN, generated a public pressure for the President of the United States to do something to alleviate that suffering. And then the second image, an image of a U.S. serviceman's body being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu after the raid on the headquarters of a Somali warlord there. This leads to, in this story, a public revulsion, a demand to withdraw. And so if this story is right, that it's really about images, we can kind of bookend this with images of starving children get us in, images of our dead servicemen get us out. It's all explained by a CNN effect. Now, it turns out, I want to argue today that this story is almost entirely wrong, or at least at best incomplete. Now, I think these images do point to two cross pressures that influence policymakers in contemplating humanitarian intervention. On the one hand, an impulse to do something, a genuine humanitarian urge to respond to these kinds of crises. And on the other hand, an aversion to casualties, an aversion to paying the costs in terms of blood and treasure to do this. And these are cross pressures that policymakers definitely feel. But ultimately, I'm going to argue today that they are not responsible ultimately for the tragedy of Somalia, which is instead rooted in the decisions of the president and military leaders in response to their own preferences and constraints and needs. So I want to talk about how this tragedy unfolded, and since it is a tragedy, it's going to unfold appropriately in 5 acts.